This happened. There are records, but almost no one remembers it. For centuries, Rome tolerated rituals that bordered on madness. Blood sacrifices, self-mutilation, ecstatic trances. But there was one ritual so disturbing, so psychologically destructive that even Rome, hardened by violence, decided it had to be erased. Not because it challenged the gods, not because it threatened the state, but because people who participated in it began to die, together. Not in battle, not by execution, by their own hands. Rome and the fear of the mind. The Roman Empire did not fear death. It feared disorder. Gladiators died for entertainment. Slaves were crucified by the thousands. Entire cities were erased without remorse. But Rome understood something fundamental. A society can survive violence. It cannot survive mass psychological collapse. Religion for Rome was not faith. It was control. Rituals were permitted as long as they reinforced stability. Gods were welcomed as long as they did not fracture the collective mind. And yet, hidden in the margins of Roman religion, there existed a cult that did exactly that. A ritual not centered on worship, but on self-annihilation. The cult of voluntary descent. The ritual had no official name. In surviving records, it is referred to indirectly. The descent, the final offering, or simply, that ceremony. It was practiced privately, at night, often outside city walls. Its followers were not criminals. They were citizens, soldiers, widows, priests who had lost faith in the public gods. And what united them was not rebellion. It was despair, a dangerous belief. At the core of the ritual was a belief deeply rooted in Roman psychology, that the soul could become trapped between worlds. Romans feared restless spirits, the lemurs, the larvae, the dead who could not pass on. This cult taught something more terrifying. That life itself could become a prison. That consciousness, once fractured by grief or guilt, could never fully return. And that the only escape was a synchronized exit. Not suicide as punishment, not suicide as shame, but suicide as liberation, preparation of the mind. The ritual did not begin with death. It began weeks earlier. Participants were isolated. They fasted. They slept little. They were encouraged to relive their worst memories. Loss, failure, guilt. Priests of the cult, known as custodes liminis, guardians of the threshold, guided them. Not with comfort, but with relentless questioning. Why do you remain? Who would suffer if you vanished? What binds you to this world? Slowly, identity eroded. The individual dissolved into the group. Modern psychology would recognize this immediately. Rome did not. The night of the ritual, the ceremony took place underground. Catacombs, abandoned cisterns, natural caves once used for forbidden rites. Torches were dimmed. Incense filled the air, thick, suffocating. Participants stood in a circle. No one spoke. Silence was essential, because silence breaks the will faster than words. At the center stood a shallow basin filled with dark liquid. Wine mixed with herbs known even then to induce dissociation. Each participant drank. Not enough to kill. Enough to detach. Collective dissolution. The priests began chanting. Not prayers. Narratives. They spoke of a world beyond pain. Beyond memory. Beyond identity. A place where names were unnecessary. Where guilt could not follow. The chant had a rhythm. Slow, repetitive, hypnotic. Heartbeat rhythm. Breath rhythm. One by one, participants began to sway. Some wept. Some smiled. Some whispered apologies to no one. And then the final instruction was given. Not shouted. Not commanded. Whispered. When the self dissolves, the body must follow. The first mass death. The earliest documented incident occurred during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. 23 bodies were discovered in an underground chamber outside Rome. No signs of struggle. No forced wounds. Each had died by a different method. Poison, blades, suffocation. What shocked authorities was not the deaths. It was the expressions. Calm, almost relieved, as if fear had been removed. Rome reacts. At first, officials dismissed it. A cult, a tragedy. But then it happened again, and again. Groups ranging from 5 to 30. Different cities. Same ritual pattern. Same psychological profile. Rome began to understand. This was not random suicide. This was contagion. Why Rome was terrified? Rome feared rebellion. But rebellion could be crushed. What Rome feared more was ideas that made people want to disappear. Because how do you govern citizens who no longer fear death? How do you punish those who see punishment as release? The ritual was doing something unprecedented. It removed the Roman fear of dying and replaced it with a longing for non-existence. The decision to erase it. The Senate acted quietly. No public trial. No official decree carved in stone. Instead, arrests, executions, confiscation of texts. Mentions of the ritual were banned from public discourse. Priests associated with it vanished. Literally, their names erased from records. Rome did not outlaw the ritual because it was immoral. Rome outlawed it because it worked. But suppression did not end it. It only forced it deeper underground. And what survived would resurface centuries later, in forms that still haunt the human mind today. It did not disappear. It adapted. Rome believed that by erasing names, burning scrolls, and executing priests, the ritual would die. But rituals rooted in psychology do not vanish. They migrate. And what this one carried with it was not theology, but a method. Survivors who should not have lived. Not everyone who entered the ritual chamber died. Some were interrupted. Some hesitated. Some were physically removed before the final act. Rome called them superstites, survivors. But these individuals were never the same. Records described them as hollow, detached, unable to reintegrate into ordinary life. They spoke of feeling unfinished, as if part of them had already crossed a threshold and never returned. Modern psychiatry would identify this as severe dissociation, survivor's guilt, and depressive collapse. Rome simply called it corruption of the soul. The aftermath nobody understood. These survivors became walking evidence of the ritual's power. They did not inspire fear. They inspired curiosity. Others sought them out, asking questions. What did you see? Did it hurt? Is the silence real? And unintentionally, the survivors became vectors, not of a virus, but of an idea. That death could be approached calmly. That fear could be unlearned. This terrified Roman authorities more than the ritual itself. The ritual as psychological engineering. What Rome failed to articulate but instinctively recognized was this. The ritual functioned as a form of group psychological conditioning. Step by step, it dismantled the core anchors of identity. Social belonging, personal narrative, fear of bodily harm, moral consequence. Once these were stripped away, suicide no longer appeared as an act of violence. It appeared as completion. The participants were not coerced. They were convinced. The role of the priests. The custodes liminis were not madmen. They were trained observers of human fragility. Their role was not to preach. It was to listen. They identified individuals already fractured by grief, war trauma, loss of status, or guilt. Roman society created these wounds constantly. The cult merely offered a conclusion. The priests framed the ritual as a service. We do not kill you. We free you. This distinction was crucial. It allowed participants to see themselves not as victims, but as willing travelers. A silent civil war. By the late 1st century, Roman officials noticed something alarming. Certain legions had unusually high suicide rates. Not chaotic, not impulsive, calm, methodical, often occurring in pairs or small groups. Soldiers would leave their weapons neatly arranged. No farewell notes, just absence. Investigations revealed a pattern. Many had attended private, philosophical gatherings near the frontiers. Gatherings that echoed the structure of the forbidden ritual. Philosophy or poison. Rome prided itself on philosophy. Stoicism, in particular, respected the idea of voluntary death under certain conditions. This created dangerous ambiguity. Where did philosophy end and ritualized psychological destruction begin? The cult exploited this boundary. It used philosophical language, detachment, release, transcendence, to mask a systematic dismantling of self-preservation. The line was crossed when death stopped being an option and became the goal. The Senate's second mistake. Rome responded with force again. Philosophical schools were monitored, private religious gatherings restricted, foreign cults expelled. But repression only validated the ritual's core narrative. That Rome itself was the prison. That true freedom required departure. Each crackdown reinforced the idea that the state feared what lay beyond life. Echoes in the provinces. The ritual mutated. In Gaul, it blended with Druidic beliefs about cyclical death. In Egypt, it merged with ideas of soul fragmentation and rebirth. In Asia Minor, it intertwined with ecstatic mystery cults. The form changed. The outcome did not. Group deaths continued, often framed as sacred transitions rather than suicides. Rome could not police belief across an empire of this scale. 19. Why collective suicide is different. Individual suicide, tragic as it is, does not threaten a state. Collective suicide does. It suggests coordination, shared meaning, a narrative stronger than survival. Rome understood that if death could be ritualized and normalized within groups, loyalty to the state would dissolve. No army can function if soldiers see death as relief. No society can persist if citizens see disappearance as salvation. XX, the psychological contagion effect. Even Romans without direct contact with the ritual began changing. Writers noted a shift in tone. More references to emptiness. More fascination with oblivion. More fatalistic art. The idea had escaped the cult. It had entered culture. This is the most dangerous stage of any destructive belief, when it no longer needs ritual to propagate. The turning point. The final documented incident that forced decisive action occurred in a coastal city in southern Italy. 42 people entered a sealed chamber. None survived. The chamber walls were inscribed with a single phrase, repeated dozens of times. We are no longer afraid. For Rome, this was the breaking point. Fear was the foundation of order, and it was gone. A new strategy. Rome realized something essential. You cannot defeat a psychological ritual with swords. You must replace it. And so began the quiet sponsorship of alternative belief systems that emphasized hope beyond suffering, individual salvation without self-destruction, meaning without annihilation. Unintentionally, this opened space for new religions, including one that would eventually dismantle Rome itself. But that is not where this story ends, because the structure of the ritual survived long after the empire fell. Hidden, adapted, renamed, waiting for new minds. The empire did not fall in a single moment. It fractured, and in those fractures, the ritual found new hosts. The fear inherited by the early church. When Christianity emerged within the Roman world, it inherited more than roads and laws. It inherited terror. Early Christian leaders were acutely aware of the forbidden ritual, not always by name, but by pattern. They saw groups abandoning life together. They saw death framed as purification. They saw despair ritualized. And they understood something critical. If martyrdom blurred into voluntary annihilation, the new faith would collapse. Redefining martyrdom, early Christianity honored those who died for faith, but it drew a sharp boundary. Martyrdom must be imposed, not chosen. This distinction was not theological abstraction. It was a defensive wall against a known psychological trap. Church councils debated this intensely. Texts that appeared to glorify death were edited, reframed, or rejected. Not because death was evil, but because desiring it collectively was dangerous. Suicide as heresy. Before this period, suicide in Roman culture was morally ambiguous. After the ritual's devastation, it became something else. A threat. Christian doctrine reframed suicide not as failure or shame, but as rebellion against divine order. Life became sacred not because it was pleasant, but because it was not ours to end. This was not purely spiritual. It was psychological containment, theological countermeasures. The church deployed deliberate narrative strategies. Suffering was temporary. Meaning existed within pain. Salvation required endurance, not escape. These ideas directly opposed the ritual's core promise. Where the ritual offered silence, the church offered hope. Where the ritual erased identity, the church preserved the soul. This was not coincidence. It was response. Suppressed texts and silent knowledge. Not all church leaders forgot the ritual. Some monasteries preserved references, locked away, untranslated, rarely read. Warnings disguised as theology. They knew that naming the ritual explicitly could revive it, so it was described indirectly, as the error of those who flee life together, as the heresy of collective despair. Silence became protection, the medieval reappearance. Centuries later, the pattern resurfaced. Not in Rome, in isolated communities. During plagues, famines, religious hysteria, groups began seeking purification through death. The church responded brutally. Movements that even hinted at collective self-destruction were eradicated, not debated, not negotiated, destroyed, because the memory of Rome lingered. The flagellants and the threshold. One such movement, the flagellants, flirted dangerously with the ritual structure. Public suffering, collective trance, erosion of self through repetition and pain. The church tolerated them briefly, then banned them decisively. not because they challenged authority, but because they walked too close to the threshold. The pattern identified. By the late Middle Ages, theologians had identified the danger clearly. Any belief system that isolates individuals, amplifies guilt, promises transcendence through annihilation, and removes fear of death will eventually produce collective suicide. The names change, the structure does not. Modern psychology discovers an old truth. Centuries later, psychology would rediscover what Rome learned the hard way. Human beings are vulnerable to meaning collapse. When identity, belonging, and future are removed simultaneously, the mind seeks termination. Not out of pain, out of logic. The ritual engineered this state deliberately. Why it still works. The most unsettling truth is this. The ritual does not require ancient gods. It does not require incense or chants. It requires only shared despair, isolation, repetition, authority. Modern cults understand this instinctively. So do extremist movements. So do some online communities. The architecture is unchanged. The disappearance of fear. Fear is not weakness. It is an anchor. When fear of death is removed without replacing meaning, the result is not freedom. It is emptiness. Rome feared this more than rebellion. The church feared it more than heresy. Because a person without fear of death cannot be governed, guided, or saved. Why this story was buried. This ritual is rarely taught. Not because it is obscure, but because it forces an uncomfortable realization that under certain conditions, human beings will choose non-existence together. Not because they are evil, not because they are insane, but because the mind, once stripped of meaning, seeks closure. The final warning. Every era believes itself immune. Rome did. The medieval world did. The modern world does. But the ritual never needed temples, only minds. And wherever despair becomes organized, the threshold opens again. History does not repeat itself. It refines itself. What Rome attempted to erase did not vanish with temples or empires. It dissolved into patterns, subtle, adaptable, invisible to those who do not know where to look. And that is why this final part matters. The ritual without a name. In the modern world, the ritual no longer wears religious symbols. There are no altars, no priests in robes, no incense thickening the air. But the structure remains. Groups form around shared despair. Language shifts toward detachment. Death is reframed as relief. Identity dissolves into collective meaning. The ritual no longer says die. It says, there is nothing left for you here. Why modern societies struggle to see it? Rome understood something modern societies resist admitting. That humans do not only seek pleasure or survival. They seek coherence. When coherence collapses, when life no longer makes narrative sense, the mind does not panic. It simplifies. And the simplest conclusion is absence. Modern cultures often medicalize this response, or moralize it, or ignore it. Rome recognized it as systemic risk. The digital threshold. The most efficient environment for the ritual today is not underground chambers. It is digital space. Isolation without solitude. Connection without belonging. Repetition without reflection. Language spreads faster than reason. Despair clusters. And when enough individuals share the same conclusion, the ritual no longer needs coordination. It becomes spontaneous, self-organizing, authority without faces. The custodes liminis once guided the ritual. Today, authority is diffuse. Algorithms, influencers, anonymous figures elevated by repetition rather than wisdom. No one commands, but everyone reinforces. This is more dangerous than hierarchy, because responsibility evaporates. The illusion of choice. Participants in the ancient ritual believed they were choosing freely. They were not lying. But choice shaped under sustained psychological pressure is not freedom, is inevitability. Modern iterations function the same way, by narrowing perceived futures until disappearance feels logical. Not tragic, not dramatic, just reasonable. What Rome tried to teach us. Rome did not ban the ritual out of compassion. It banned it out of survival instinct. But embedded in that instinct was an unspoken lesson. A society must protect meaning as fiercely as it protects borders. Because when meaning collapses, laws become irrelevant. Why suppression alone fails? Rome tried erasure. The church tried doctrine. Both learned the same truth. You cannot eliminate the ritual by forbidding death. You must offer something stronger than oblivion. Hope is not naivete. It is infrastructure, the most dangerous misconception. The most dangerous belief is that only the weak fall into these patterns. The Roman ritual attracted veterans, intellectuals, priests, citizens with status and education. Despair does not discriminate. It organizes, remembering what was buried. This story is rarely told because it destabilizes comfortable narratives. It reveals that civilization rests not only on laws and armies, but on fragile psychological agreements. That life is worth continuing. That suffering is not final. That identity can survive fracture. When those agreements dissolve, rituals return. Even without names. The final parallel. Rome feared collective suicide because it represented a silent vote against existence. A refusal to participate. A withdrawal that no punishment could reverse. Modern societies face the same threat, not from swords or invasion, but from coordinated disengagement. The quiet responsibility. Understanding this history imposes responsibility. Not to fear death, but to recognize when narratives are pushing minds toward erasure. Not to censor despair, but to interrupt its organization. Rome waited too long. The last record. One final fragment survives in a damaged Roman manuscript. The author's name is lost. The line reads, "They did not wish to die. They wished to stop being." Rome understood the difference. So should we. Closing. This ritual was banned. Its priests erased. Its chambers sealed. But its logic endured, because the most dangerous rituals are not performed with blades or poison, but with ideas. Ideas that remove fear, without replacing meaning. And that is why this story matters. Because it is not ancient history. It is a warning. This part was never written in Roman ink. Because it is not ancient. It is ongoing. The error of assuming we are different. Every civilization that encounters this pattern believes it belongs to the past. Rome believed it. Medieval Europe believed it. The modern world believes it. Each time, the assumption is the same. We are more educated, more rational, more protected. But the ritual does not target ignorance. It targets fracture. And fracture is timeless. When meaning collapses faster than life. What Rome discovered, and what modern societies often deny, is that material stability does not guarantee psychological stability. Food, safety, and technology cannot compensate for loss of purpose, erosion of identity, absence of belonging. When meaning collapses faster than life conditions improve, despair feels irrational, yet spreads efficiently. The ritual thrives precisely in this contradiction, the seduction of final clarity. The ritual's most powerful promise was never death. It was clarity. Participants described relief, not because pain ended, but because uncertainty did. No more decisions. No more waiting. No more ambiguity. In psychological terms, this is catastrophic closure. The mind trades infinite complexity for absolute simplicity. And it feels like peace. Why group despair feels safer than solitude? Isolation intensifies suffering, but shared despair transforms it. When many people arrive at the same conclusion, the conclusion feels validated. This is why the ritual always favor groups. Not mobs. Not crowds. Small, intimate circles. Enough to feel confirmed. Not enough to be challenged. The danger of romanticizing darkness. Cultures often aestheticize despair. They mistake articulation for insight, depth for wisdom, silence for transcendence. Rome learned too late that darkness, when ritualized, becomes persuasive. Not because it lies, but because it tells partial truths without context. Pain is real. Suffering is real. But annihilation is not resolution. The responsibility of witnesses. Those who understand this pattern become witnesses. And witnesses carry a burden. Not to preach, not to moralize, but to recognize when narratives are narrowing futures. When language shifts from, "I am hurting," to, "There is no reason to continue." That shift is the threshold. What actually stops the ritual? History offers a clear answer. Not fear, not punishment, not censorship. What interrupts the ritual is counter-meaning. Narratives strong enough to hold suffering without glorifying erasure. Communities that allow despair without organizing it. Hope that is not naive but resilient. Rome's final failure. Rome banned the ritual, but it never healed the conditions that created it. War trauma, displacement, loss of identity. The ritual was a symptom. Suppression treated the manifestation, not the disease. That lesson remains unresolved. Why this story was told. This is not a warning against belief. It is a warning against unexamined narratives. Any system, religious, ideological, cultural, digital, that removes fear of death, without strengthening reasons to live, walks the same path, even unintentionally. The last silence. In one Roman record, a magistrate wrote after witnessing the aftermath of a collective death. They left no curse, no rebellion, only silence. And silence frightened us more than anger. Silence still frightens societies, because it signals withdrawal. Final reflection. The ritual did not fail because it was false. It failed because it was incomplete. It understood suffering, but not endurance. It offered escape, but not transformation. And humanity keeps rediscovering this imbalance. Closing words. If this story unsettles you, it should. Not because it describes death, but because it describes a loss of reasons to remain. Rome feared that loss more than enemies. So should we, because the most dangerous rituals are not hidden underground. They are the ones we perform silently, together, without realizing we have begun. This was not a story about death. It was a story about what happens when meaning disappears. Rome banned the ritual because it understood something we still forget. When people stop fearing death, it is not freedom that follows. It is collapse. History did not erase this pattern. It only hid it. And the question is no longer whether it will return, but whether we will recognize it before silence feels like relief again.